Click OK on this. Hello. Very happy to be here, everyone. Today I wanted to talk about Ghosted, Black women, spirits, and hauntology in games. What we're going to go over just briefly, I'll do a little bit of an about me, and then go into some hauntology theory, followed by Southern Black history, and then we'll do some case studies on two video games that were really fun to play last year. So I am Rochelle, she, her. I am a game designer and a death doula. I work in an overlapping space with death studies, game studies, and mental health in games, whether that's designing games about mental health or designing games that talk about grief, or finding unique ways to use games as a um, creative, therapeutic way for people to process grief, talk about death, and just generally have conversations about mental health. I'm really passionate about that. And so that leads me to today's talk, where I am just really keen on the topic of um, I love the horror video games, and I love when it intersects with some really cool cultural elements, specifically when it comes to Black women and the history of ghosts. So, ghost stories. I think a lot of Black people grow up around ghosts. Not always in the sense of apparitions or horror stories, but in the sense that the dead are never understood as entirely absent. For example, I grew up hearing stories from my mom. She's from Alabama. We have family from Georgia as well. So she grew up hearing stories about relatives appearing in dreams just before someone in the family died, or loved ones visiting after they died, as if they were checking in or leaving messages and warnings. Also, I remember many times riding through the South when she would suddenly tell me to bite my thumb if we were driving past a graveyard. And I was so confused when I was younger, but she would tell me, oh, it's so, the spirits don't follow you home and it's bad luck if you don't do it. I'm like, okay. These stories, oddly enough, they weren't ever presented as fantasy, just something that was spoken about casually, and we were just supposed to fold it into our ordinary life. And I think this inheritance matters. Because it's reflecting a deeper cultural logic in which our memory and ancestry and the dead remain active participants in our present. Within this framework, the boundaries between worlds are not fixed, and the past doesn't disappear. It ends up coming back to speak, and it returns and it acts through our everyday lives. So, um, this is the same logic that structures games like South of Midnight and Ghost Detective, which is what I'm going to talk about later. These games don't just use ghosts as narrative devices or aesthetic elements, but they're building entire worlds out of a worldview in which the dead are present, communicative, and emotionally consequential. And so here, what I have on the screen, this is Big Liz on the left. She's a ghost story from the Maryland area, an enslaved woman who lost her head. And so you'll hear a lot of stories about people who were enslaved, people who experienced racial violence. On the right is the Black Hope Cemetery in Texas. It's said that it was a freedman's burial ground with a lot of unmarked graves that it was being built over. By some commercial development, and it was said that it was haunted. So when we also think about um, this sensibility of how the past never goes away and it's there. One thing this brings me to is the Black Gothic. So this sensibility profoundly shapes um, this tradition. I mean, we often think about it with classic Gothic literature. I have some examples here with The Fall of the House of Usher and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where we have these recurring images and themes of resurrection and madness, general unease and curses and isolation. Um, and there's a sense of decay and repression amongst these stories too. But the Black Gothic traditions, I think they inherit many of the same atmospheres. You got your hauntings, your ghosts, decay, cursed spaces, but I think they become different when they're tied to a different historical experience. Um, in Black American literature, the haunted house isn't just frightening because it's mysterious. It's often frightening because history happened there. And the landscape itself is carrying evidence of that. So the past itself is still socially, emotionally, and geographically present. In the examples here in Beloved, the haunting is inseparable from slavery, from motherhood, and memory, and just the psychological violence of surviving that kind of historical terror. Um, and the ghost is more than a supernatural device. It's representing a history that can't be cleanly buried because the effects of it continue shaping the lives of the living. In that story, a family is tortured and haunted by what's happened in the past. And in a newer book, Ring Shout, this one tackles like monstrous creatures that emerge directly from racial hatred and white supremacist violence. So the supernatural becomes a way of making this social horror visible. And it's not just death that's haunting these stories, but the persistence of this racial violence across generations. So I think this is where this Black Gothic tradition becomes especially important for understanding haunting in contemporary culturally Black media. Um, because it's all of these environments that are carrying the weight of what happened inside of them. And this becomes a way of narrating how the unresolved histories continue living in everyone and in everything within them. So this brings us to a little bit more about the games we're going to talk about. What makes this especially important is that these traditions, they don't just remain confined to literature. So the Black Gothic is increasingly appearing across contemporary visual culture and digital media, where games in particular allow players to move through haunted environments rather than simply observe them. So interactive worlds make haunting experiential, where players are able to actually traverse through these ghost towns, these graveyards and abandoned homes, and these liminal landscapes. Um, these games, in particular, South of Midnight and Ghost Detective, um, they allow, they're significant because they're centered on Black protagonists in Black Southern worlds where haunting isn't it's more than just reduced to atmosphere and aesthetics. The supernatural is really interwoven with thinking about inherited violence, communal grief, and history. So the player isn't just escaping monsters, they're also um, navigating these ghost stories in real time. And so both of these games are full of ghosts. Some of like the real ones that you would kind of expect to see in a game, but then also some that you wouldn't expect to see there. Um, some more maybe philosophical type specters. These worlds are actually shaped by these unresolved histories and wounds that are embedded within the communities long after the original violence has passed. And what especially interests me about these two games in particular is the fact that they are positioning Black women as the figureheads. Um, they are the figures that are capable of moving through these haunted environments and interpreting what remains there. They're asked to listen to the dead, to confront buried histories, and to care for wounds that continue to fester and to linger. So a little bit more into the hauntology aspect. Um, One moment. Okay, so here, I'm not going to spend too much time like going into these three, but I just wanted to pull back a little bit and kind of share how I got here. I was thinking a lot about these texts in particular because the experiences of haunting, it's not just cultural or a spiritual idea. Um, I was really surprised as I started looking into this to find scholars that are across philosophy, sociology, and Black studies and literary theory that are developing language and explaining why certain histories don't seem to stay in the past. And so some of the thinkers that I want to briefly focus on were Jacques Derrida, Avery Gordon, and Christina Sharp, because together they build a framework for understanding haunting, not as fantasy, but as a way of really describing how historical trauma persists socially, emotionally, spiritually, and culturally. And so while all these scholars are writing in different contexts, I think at the core, all three of them are ultimately concerned with the same central problem, which is what happens when violence is never fully resolved, and what happens when the past remains active inside the present, and what happens when people are forced to continue living alongside these histories that still shape everyday life. I think taken together, that framework becomes especially important for understanding contemporary Black Gothic media and the haunted world that these games construct. So going into this one a little bit. So Derrida is really not talking about ghosts and as cultural stories, but more interested in what it means for something to exist without fully existing. Um, his arguments are that the Western thought schools tend to assume that reality is made up of things that are clearly present and fully available to perception. But experience repeatedly shows otherwise. Ideas, histories, promises, and losses continue to shape the present, even when they're no longer visible in a concrete sense. So these presences without presence are referred to as specters in his work. And a specter is something that hasn't really fully settled in the first place. It's something that's never been finished. Um, and it's an absence that continues to structure how the present is understood. And what makes this foundational to this discussion is the language that he gives to it. Um, the concept of hauntology is both simple and difficult at the same time because it's saying that the present has never been pure. It's never been isolated and on its own. It's always inhabited by what is missing, what's incomplete, what's unresolved. And when we look at Avery Gordon's work in Ghostly Matters, um, she is shifting the idea of haunting away from philosophy and more into social everyday life, and asking, what does it mean when something has been removed from view, but it continues to shape how people live? And still, she's not even talking about the ghosts that we know from fiction and fantasy. She's also talking about ghosts as, excuse me, moments when history does not stay in the past, especially when that history involves violence or inequality that's been either deliberately hidden or it's being censored or it's trying not to bring attention. Someone's trying not to bring attention to it. And so this haunting is what happens when something that should have been resolved hasn't been resolved. It's basically a call for justice, a call for resolution, and it exerts pressure on the present to be seen. So these ghosts are appearing in social institutions, in our landscapes, in our geographies, in the ways that people move throughout the world without fully naming what is affecting them. Um, this is important because it treats haunting as a method of attention seeking. Um, and to notice what is haunting is also a call to notice what's been structurally excluded from official accounts of reality or of history, for example. So it just becomes a way, haunting becomes a way for the world to be able to read the world for its absences as well as its presences. And um, last but not least, Christina Sharp's work of In the Wake. Um, so what makes this work so interesting amidst the other two is that Christina Sharp specifically talks about Black life and very clearly states that slavery isn't a completed historical period that sits safely in the past. Um, she interrogates what it means to live in the ongoing conditions that slavery created and never fully ended. She uses the term in the wake um, because it evokes that imagery of a wake, the trail that's left behind a ship moving through the water, or even a funeral wake. Um, so she's talking a lot about the condition of living after a catastrophe that has not been resolved. So living in the aftermath of it, or the afterlife, as she refers to. And so she just posits that Black life is still present in the afterlife in this odd way. Um, the structures produced by slavery, racial inequality, premature death, dispossession, surveillance, environmental and economic vulnerability, they continue shaping how life is lived in the present. And to counter, well, not to counter this, but to complement this, she introduces a term of wake work, which is what she calls the everyday practices of survival, of care, um, and resilience that Black people develop in order to live within these ongoing conditions. So it includes the emotional and social labors of holding memory in these environments that often refuse to acknowledge the weight of what has happened. And so the present isn't separate from the past. Again, there's that theme. And it's structured by its continuing motion instead. And so we are reframing survival itself as a form of knowledge as we are living in the afterlife. So taken all together, I take this to kind of create a haunted Black framework. Um, I think what connects these thinkers is that all three of them reject the idea that history simply disappears. Derrida gave us the language of the specter, of hauntology, the idea that unresolved histories continue returning inside the present. Gordon shows how haunting operates socially and politically through the persistence of violence that institutions attempt to bury or suppress. And then Sharp is showing us how Black life itself unfolds within this ongoing afterlife of historical catastrophe. And together, these works help understand haunting not as a fantasy, but as a way of describing how memory and violence and grief and history continue shaping lived experiences across time. Now, Black communities didn't need postmodern theories to understand haunting. Like I was sharing earlier about some of my family's ghost stories and superstitions, Black Southern traditions have long imagined the boundary between the living and the dead and seen it as something that's permeable. Um, and so some deeper questions become raised. So, what exactly are the ghosts that continue haunting Black cultural memory? What are the histories that are returning? And how did Black communities develop these traditions for living alongside the dead? So we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson, um, and looking at uh, the American South in particular. We're not just looking at a geographic region. We're looking at the result of a layered spiritual and historical landscape that's shaped by migration and violence, survival, and cultural memory. So, from the 17th through the 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. Along with them came deeply rooted spiritual systems, especially traditions from West and Central Africa that didn't disappear under slavery, but they were adapted and they transformed into new conditions. So, one of the most important of these was ancestor veneration. It's a widespread practice across African traditional religions in which the dead are understood as still present in social and spiritual life, and they're there to guide you, to give you warnings, and to help protect you. And now, when we look at the American South again, these beliefs, they didn't remain isolated. So they ended up blending with Christianity under the conditions of enslavement and then later on segregation, producing these syncretic traditions that included dreams, visions, and more layers on spiritual communication alongside folk healing practices. So this is where the traditions kind of grouped under hoodoo emerge, sometimes called conjure, which just emphasize spiritual protection, communication with the dead, and practical ritualistic life grounded in everyday survival. And so a specific example would be coming from the Low Country. So in communities like the Gullah Geechee, people of the southeastern coastal regions of South Carolina and Georgia, these communities remained especially strong because of their geographic isolation of the sea islands and the rice plantations there. So some of the enslaved Africans from the Sierra Leone, Angola, Senegal, and the Congo Kingdom were brought in large numbers for their agricultural knowledge, and particularly their rice cultivation. And so a lot of the linguistic and spiritual traditions persisted in this region for generations and to this day. Um, they developed one of the most distinct African diasporic cultures in the United States, preserving Creole language patterns, storytelling traditions, praise music, basket weaving, burial customs, the works. Um, and so there's still a lot of similarities between Gullah spiritual beliefs and African cosmologies, especially when it comes to the worlds of the living and the dead as interconnected rather than fully separate. Um, Within many Low Country Black traditions, communication with the dead was not necessarily interpreted as a taboo or supernatural horror film sense kind of thing. Um, it was very common for people to have dreams or visions and encounters with deceased relatives, and it was often called the practice of seeking, where you're asking for you're consulting them and you want their guidance. So it was something that was positive. And a lot of their practices there just reinforce the ancestral veneration and the fact that spirits remain socially present within the community life. Um, so this just created a religious world in which the natural and supernatural were understood as deeply entwined. And talking with the dead, talking to ghosts wasn't so scary. And we see this also when we look towards Louisiana, especially New Orleans. This became one of the most important sites of African diasporic spiritual continuity in the United States. Because of both the French and Spanish colonial rule, large populations of enslaved Africans from West and Central Africa, they retained their stronger continuities with African ritual practices, um, cosmologies, and the ancestral veneration as well. So these beliefs too, they blended with Catholic traditions, centered on saints and candles, altars, and other syncretic practices like Louisiana voodoo, hoodoo again, and conjure. Um, And they have some very lively traditions, like their spirit stories, jazz, funerals, and communication with the dead really made this area popular and known for this connection to the living and the dead here. And again, it wasn't seen as something weird or scary. It just functioned as a part of normal life. You consult your ancestors, you ask the spirits for help, for protection. Um, and this history explains why New Orleans became one of America's most culturally haunted landscapes, and why contemporary games like South of Midnight and Ghost Detective continue to draw from these southern worlds where the dead and spirits and these cultural practices remain active forces within everyday life. And now tying that to our digital hauntings, when we move into the contemporary video game space with all of this background knowledge, we can see how these older spiritual and cultural frameworks aren't disappearing, but in fact, they're being reimagined in a playable interactive form. So in South of Midnight and Ghost Detective, we encounter Black women protagonists who are moving through these liminal spaces. The boundaries between the living and the dead it's unstable, it's impermeable. I mean, it's permeable. And communication with the spirits, it isn't framed as abnormal, but it's just a part of how reality works. And in these games specifically, it's the mechanic that progresses you through the game. You have to speak to the dead. You have to confront the dead. So it's just really amazing to me how these games are echoing these long-standing cultural frameworks in Black Southern life. Whereas we saw in the Gullah Geechee and the Louisiana traditions, the dead are remaining socially present. They're being consulted. They're a part of life. They help life be just that much more richer. So when these games are depicting characters speaking with the dead and crossing these thresholds and navigating these landscapes, it's not just a Gothic aesthetic or a fantasy trope. Um, Whether consciously or not, it's actually translating these existing cultural logics and bringing them into these digital experiences. And so this is just another way to see how cultural inheritance continues to shape how Black life is not only lived in the real world, but how it's imagined as well, and how it's represented in the medium of games. So going into a deep dive of South of Midnight. Now, I don't know who has played South of Midnight. Hopefully someone has in the in the chat. I'll see later. But it's a third-person action adventure game developed by Compulsion Games, and it was published by Xbox last year, and it came out last year. So the game blends narrative-driven exploration and combat and supernatural storytelling within a stylized version of the American South, inspired deeply by Southern Gothic aesthetics, Louisiana, a lot of Southern folklore and mythologies, and Black Southern spiritual traditions. The protagonist here is Hazel Flood. Um, she isn't introduced as like this chosen fantasy hero right off the bat. She's actually introduced as just a teenager. She has a very ordinary life. She has she comes from a broken home. She's raised by a single mother who's a social worker in the city. So she does a lot of care work and she's tired when she gets home. Sometimes they miss cues from each other. She has so her mother is already showing these themes of care and survival that are going to be seen in the rest of the game. Um, and Hazel's world isn't just about the presence of things, it's also about the absence. She is cut off from her paternal grandmother and just the whole paternal side of her family. And this broken family, this rupture, becomes narratively significant because it represents a break in inherited knowledge and cultural and access to cultural memory, um, particularly the kind that's passed through family lines. So this sets up the game's formal tension. Hazel ends up not entering a magical world from the outside, but actually returning to something that's structurally tied to her own lineage. So the magic is inside. I know that sounds cliche. Um, so diving deeper into South of Midnight, Hazel is actually, she discovers that she's a weaver. So this isn't your conventional magic class. It's actually a surprisingly relational position within a spiritual system that the game sets up. So perception itself is historically and emotionally charged with Hazel's powers. Um, as a weaver, Hazel is able to perceive what is normally hidden, like spirits, emotional residues, and like fractured pieces of history from times past. And she can definitely fight. You can do lots of combat in this game, but not everything she does is about fighting. She also does a lot of interpretation and repair. She's tasked with restoring balance in the land and where emotional and historical ruptures have destabilized reality. So in Hazel's case, her powers really emerge once she starts recognizing her lineage and learning more about that, which she was previously disconnected from. So it's like it's a homecoming story too. So with the haunted presences in the game, the spirit ecology in South of Midnight it's not uniform and it's really rich because you have some entities who behave like almost like their human selves. So you see more human emotion and human memories and flashbacks, which this requires Hazel to be more interpretive and communicate rather than confronting them. And then you have other spirits called haints, which manifest as distorted or hostile forms, and they represent unresolved psychological or historical ruptures. So one important recurring figure in the game is the presence of earlier weavers. You'll see spectral or fragmentary manifestations of a weaver named Mahalia, who's kind of modeled after Harriet Tubman. And you'll see her, like glimpses of her from the past, guiding folks to freedom and helping people. And Hazel is accessing these little spiritual flashbacks as she's going on her own journey. So it's suggesting that Hazel isn't just some new person on the scene, but she is joining a long and stable inheritance of people who have carried this title and this role before her. So this is a world where spirits aren't just monsters in a vacuum coming out of nowhere, but they are expressions of layered emotional and historical accumulation. And in the screenshot, you can see a flashback of Mahalia, the previous weaver that Hazel is witnessing for the first time. And at a structural level, South of Midnight is operating through a Black hauntological framework. Because history is not treated as something that's completed, but it's something that's continuously active within the present. Every generation has a weaver because a weaver's role is important to the fabric of reality itself. Someone has to come through and resolve these distortions, um, listen to these spirits calling out for help and try to mend, or else everything falls apart. So she's picking up a mantle that's been in her family for a long time, and it's necessary to keep things going. She's not just fighting supernatural threats, she's actually weaving things together to try to keep history, the present, and everything um, in alignment and in balance. And so this aligns with broader Gothic and Black diasporic traditions in which, again, I'm going to say these a lot. Memory, ancestry, and unresolved histories are not contained in the past, but they remain active forces that are shaping the perception of people in the present. They're inspiring responsibility and care in the present. And what makes this game significant isn't just that it's about ghosts in the South. Um, but it's centering its whole narrative around the idea that reality itself is layered with these ghosts, these unresolved calls for justice and histories, and that people like Hazel and Mahalia before her um, are tasked with learning how to listen to it and try to repair it. So going to our second example, this takes us to Ghost Detective. This is a narrative-driven hidden object puzzle game. I love hidden object puzzle games. Developed by Wooga. So it's also available through Netflix games. If you have a Netflix subscription, you can play Ghost Detective. You'll just download the game to your mobile phone and just play it that way. Um, it's set in a stylized version of New Orleans, where the game follows a murder detective who returns as a ghost to um, solve her own homicide. And so this is Tessa. Tessa, her story begins in a place that seems to be familiar. Okay, we're in a detective story. She's a New Orleans police officer. She's trained to believe in the evidence, in procedures and cause and effect. And her world is just built on the assumption that, oh yeah, every crime has a traceable origin, every death has a resolution. I solve things, that's all I do. And then suddenly her world is rocked when she is killed in the line of duty. And instead of death being the end, it's actually the beginning for her because she wakes up as a ghost. And Tessa, in the game, it diverges from her waking up alone as a ghost, and it changes the traditional detective story into something a little different. Because now Tessa is moving between two worlds. Um, she is still able to occupy the living city of New Orleans, but she can't really fully access it anymore. But now she's also a new inhabitant of this previously secret spirit world that apparently populates the city at the same time as the living. Um, and she also has other spirits around her who are also, like her, emotionally and historically unfinished in some way. So she ends up building alliances across this divide. So she works with Red, and seen in the screenshot below, he's the ghost of a bartender at one of the oldest bars in the city. She worked with her sister, who's in the top screenshot, and even her ex-partner, her ex-cop partner, to try to solve the mystery of, you know, her murder. And so along the way, she also encounters other spirits who are trapped on this plane because of their unfinished business. And she actually takes little side quests and missions to help them as well to find their closure. Um, and so New Orleans itself is not just the background in this game, it's actually this interesting threshold geography where the boundaries between life and death are so thin, they're existing at the same time. And Tessa finally sees this. And what you see here is that Tessa learns that as she moves through the world, she encounters these spirits who are also manifestations of unresolved, unfinished business. The game calls them lost souls. Those are ghosts who get stuck in emotion and they lose themselves. So these are individuals whose deaths have been, who have not been socially, emotionally, or morally resolved. And in some cases, this lack of resolution causes them to erupt in what's called a soul storm. So it affects the mechanics of the gameplay when you have a ghost that's become a lost soul. And it's actually a mechanic in the game where you try to prevent that. So you actively try to bring these ghosts closure because if a soul storm happens, then it just creates a really challenging level that you have to play through. Um, and so what I think is important about this is that the game isn't just treating these as just enemies or monstrous characters. It's really framing their haunting as a consequence. It's a consequence of the continuation of harms that hasn't been acknowledged or repaired. And it also says that death doesn't end the narrative, and you can see how it actually just extends its pressure from beyond the grave. And Tessa here, her role over the course of the game, she ultimately shifts from an investigator to a mediator. She doesn't operate within a system of, oh, truth is only one thing. It's purely physical, and it's just like a legal criminal justice kind of truth, and that's it. Um, she learns more about layered forms of existence and of evidence. So she's looking beyond um, at things like memory and history and spirits and how those impact what the truth is and what the present is. So this game ends up suggesting in a wildly unexpected way that justice itself can't be contained within the living world alone, that there is death justice to reckon with as well. And Tessa becomes the figure that's responsible for navigating this conversation. And taken together, um, taken together between the two of these characters, between Hazel and Tessa, um, what we see is that whether they realize it or not, the designers who made these games, they tapped into something cultural and something deeply inherent to Black lives in America, especially. With these two characters choosing the setting that they did in the American South, um, Louisiana in Ghost Detective, and kind of a sort of a mix of places in the South of Midnight. They actually tapped into this long chain of haunting, of Black haunting that has existed through unresolved harms and unresolved histories into the present, and it it makes it so that these protagonists are kind of slotting themselves into these roles of where talking to the dead, it's our inheritance. It's what we know culturally, and so it makes sense that that's what it would look like in our imagination, in our stories too. Um, so I just found it quite interesting to see that echoes of what we know from culture and how philosophy shapes these things. We actually see them in games too. Um, and I might have spoken a bit fast, but I am actually at the end. Um, so I will stop here and I am, I guess, open for discussion now.